At Christmas dinner, my sister slapped my baby and told me I was overreacting. Everyone else just sat in silence. Then my husband, a military commander, stood up, stared her straight in the eye, and said, "Leave, now." She walked out that night and never came back. Imagine this. It was Christmas, a time for warmth and family. But for me, Natalie, it became the night my own sister, Vanessa, slapped my 6-month-old baby across the face. And as my entire family watched, frozen in silence, it felt like the world stopped turning. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared, like this horrifying moment was perfectly normal. But then my husband, David, a military commander, slowly stood up from his chair, and what happened next changed everything. 3 days later, I uncovered something even more shocking. This wasn't just about one slap. This was about 28 years of being utterly invisible in my own family, a silent truth finally bursting into the open. Sterling family Christmas dinner always was Vanessa's show. And this past December 23rd was no exception. She rolled up 2 hours late in her gleaming white Tesla, dragging in an absurd amount of ring lights and a whole camera crew. Her mission? To document her authentic family Christmas experience for her lifestyle blog. I stood there, leaning in the kitchen doorway, gently bouncing Lucas against my shoulder. He was fussy, just waking from his nap, and I watched my mother, Patricia, frantically rearrange the entire dining room, all to fit Vanessa's elaborate filming setup. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, a comforting holiday scent, but underneath it all, that familiar suffocating tension of a Sterling family gathering simmered. My father, Robert, was in his usual corner chair, scrolling through his phone, perfecting his art of selective blindness, a skill he'd mastered over years of ignoring the constant drama between his daughters. Vanessa had been hyping this dinner for weeks on her social media, calling it her family gratitude special, promising her followers an intimate look at our holiday traditions. What she conveniently forgot to mention was that David had just returned from a brutal 6-month deployment overseas. Or that we'd driven 3 hours from Cedar Falls, specifically to introduce our baby boy to his grandparents for his very first Christmas. But of course, none of that mattered when it came to Vanessa's carefully curated narrative. David emerged from the guest bedroom, looking incredibly sharp in his dress uniform, having just changed Lucas's diaper. Even off duty, he carried himself with that quiet, unwavering authority that comes from years of leading soldiers. He caught my eye across the room and gave me one of those small, comforting smiles, the kind that said, "Everything's going to be okay," even when I wasn't entirely sure it would be. The dining room? It looked like a spread right out of a glossy magazine. Vanessa had moved our grandmother's antique candlesticks to make space for her equipment, relocated cherished family photos for better angles, and even swapped out our festive napkins for ones that photographed better under her professional lighting. She was directing her cameraman around the table like she was shooting a commercial, which, let's be honest, she pretty much was. My mom, Patricia, bustled around her eldest daughter, adjusting and readjusting everything to meet Vanessa's impossibly high standards. The turkey, which had been cooling to the perfect serving temperature, was now under heat lamps to maintain its photogenic appearance. Side dishes were rearranged 3 times for visual appeal. Even the flowers had been replaced with a more photogenic arrangement Vanessa had brought from Portland. I'd learned long ago not to comment on any of this. Growing up, I'd made the mistake of pointing out the absurdity more than once, only to be met with lectures about supporting family and understanding that some people have bigger dreams than others. The implication was always crystal clear. I was small-minded for not appreciating Vanessa's vision, jealous of her success, threatened by her ambition. David helped me set Lucas in the high chair we'd brought, the same solid wood one that had belonged to David's grandmother, Eleanor, worn smooth by generations of children. It looked wonderfully, beautifully out of place among Vanessa's sterile, curated aesthetic. Lucas gurgled happily, reaching for the colorful toys hanging from the activity bar, utterly unaware that he was about to become an unwilling part of his aunt's content creation. The meal began with Vanessa's customary gratitude speech, delivered directly to her camera while the rest of us sat in awkward, expectant silence. She spoke about family traditions, the importance of coming together, and how blessed she felt to share these moments with her followers. She droned on for nearly 10 minutes without once mentioning David's deployment, Lucas's first Christmas, or anything specific about the actual people sitting around the table. When she finally finished and signaled for the filming to pause, the atmosphere shifted slightly, like a heavy blanket being lifted. Mom immediately began serving, making sure Vanessa's plate was absolutely perfect before even looking at anyone else's needs. Dad emerged from his phone long enough to carve the turkey, though he kept glancing nervously at the cameras. David and I exchanged glances, trying to navigate eating while keeping Lucas entertained and, ideally, quiet. The conversation flowed in its predictable, Vanessa-dominated pattern. She updated everyone on her latest brand partnerships, upcoming collaborations, and the exciting opportunities that seemed to fall into her lap daily. Mom hung on her every word, asking detailed questions about follower counts and engagement rates as if she were receiving a masterclass in digital marketing. I tried to contribute when there were natural openings, sharing updates about our life at Fort Henderson, David's recent promotion, and how we were adjusting to parenthood. But my stories just seemed to disappear into the air, acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation inevitably circled back to Vanessa's world. It was like trying to add ingredients to a recipe that had already been completed and plated. David noticed, of course. He always did. He made a point of asking me follow-up questions about the things I'd mentioned, drawing me back into conversations that had moved on without me. He shared stories about the base community, about the other military families we'd grown close to, about how proud he was of the way I'd managed everything during his deployment. His efforts were so kind, so supportive, but they also brutally highlighted how little interest my own family showed in my actual life. Lucas, bless his heart, was being remarkably well-behaved for a 6-month-old, content to chew on his teething toys and observe all the activity around him. Occasionally, he would babble or laugh at something that caught his attention, drawing brief, fleeting smiles from around the table before the adult conversation resumed its usual hum. He was fascinated by the bright lights from Vanessa's equipment, reaching toward them with that determined focus babies have when something truly captures their interest. Midway through the main course, Vanessa decided she wanted to film some candid family interaction footage. She had her cameraman position himself to capture what she called natural holiday moments, though there was nothing natural about performing dinner conversation for an audience of thousands. She directed us to continue eating and talking normally, while she provided commentary about the beautiful chaos of family gatherings. This was when things began to deteriorate, so gradually that it was hard to pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred. Vanessa had always been particular about maintaining control over her environment, but the combination of filming pressures and her usual need to be the absolute center of attention seemed to be escalating her stress levels to a dangerous degree. She kept calling for resets when conversations didn't flow the way she wanted, when someone's expression wasn't quite right for the camera, when background noises interfered with her audio. Lucas, meanwhile, was getting tired. His cheerful babbling had turned into that distinct whimpering that any parent recognizes as the precursor to a full meltdown. David and I tried to keep him calm with quiet songs and gentle bouncing, but the unfamiliar environment, disrupted nap schedule, and all the unusual activity was clearly overwhelming him. I suggested taking him to the guest room for a few minutes to decompress, but Vanessa immediately objected. She was in the middle of filming what she called the heart of the segment, and having people leave the table would ruin the content. She assured me that babies were adaptable, that a little fussing was normal, and that we shouldn't let it interrupt the special family time she was trying to capture. Mom, of course, agreed, adding that I was being overly cautious and that babies needed to learn to adjust to different situations. Dad just nodded along, not really looking up from his plate. David's jaw tightened slightly, the way it always did when he was choosing his words carefully in a tense situation. He suggested gently that maybe we could take a short break from filming to let everyone reset. But Vanessa was already pivoting to what she called a more authentic approach. Instead of trying to minimize Lucas's fussing, she would incorporate it into her narrative about the beautiful messiness of real family life. She began speaking to her camera about how holidays with little ones required flexibility and patience, how the unexpected moments often made the best memories. Lucas's whimpering escalated to actual crying, the kind of tired, overwhelmed sobbing that breaks a parent's heart. I reached for him instinctively, but Vanessa held up her hand to stop me. She was still filming, still trying to capture what she was now calling an authentic moment of holiday chaos. She seemed to genuinely believe Lucas's distress was adding authenticity to her content, proof that her family celebrations were real and unfiltered. David's face had gone completely still, the expression he wore when dealing with difficult situations in his command. He was watching Vanessa with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for assessing potential threats. I could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to find the diplomatic solution that would protect his son without creating a larger conflict. I tried again to reach for Lucas, and again Vanessa stopped me. This time she was more direct, explaining that I was being dramatic and that a little crying never hurt anyone. She reminded me that she had experience with children, too, having babysat throughout high school, and that sometimes parents needed to relax their overprotective instincts. Lucas's crying intensified, the desperate wailing of a baby who had reached his absolute limit. The sound filled the dining room, competing with Vanessa's continued commentary about embracing the chaos of family life. She seemed utterly oblivious to the fact that everyone else at the table had stopped eating, stopped pretending to enjoy themselves, stopped participating in her performance. That's when it happened. Vanessa, clearly frustrated that Lucas's crying was overwhelming her audio and disrupting her carefully planned segment, leaned across the table toward the high chair. Her hand moved so quickly that for a moment I wasn't sure what I'd seen. The sharp, sickening crack of her palm against Lucas's cheek echoed through the suddenly silent room. Lucas's crying stopped instantly, replaced by a shocked silence that felt like the air being sucked from the room. Then came a wail unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. A sound of pure bewilderment and pain that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. His tiny cheek was already turning red where she'd struck him. Nobody moved. Patricia sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth. Robert's eyes were wide with shock, but he remained in his chair. The cameraman kept filming, apparently unsure whether he should stop. Vanessa herself seemed momentarily stunned by what she'd done, her hand still extended across the table. But David moved. He rose from his chair with the controlled precision of someone who had spent years training for high-pressure situations. There was no rush, no sudden explosion of movement, just the deliberate unfolding of a man who had made a decision. His 6'3" frame seemed to fill the room as he stood, his dress uniform making him appear even more imposing in the suddenly silent dining room. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the kind of authority that made people listen without question. "Turn off the camera." It wasn't a request. The cameraman immediately complied, the red recording light disappearing as the room fell into an even deeper silence. David walked around the table to where Lucas sat sobbing in his high chair. He lifted our son with the gentle competence of a father who had comforted him through countless nights, holding him against his chest and murmuring soft reassurances. Lucas's cries began to subside almost immediately, reduced to hiccuping sobs as he buried his face against David's shoulder. "Vanessa?" David said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "You just struck my infant son." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I need you to explain to me why you thought that was acceptable." Vanessa's face had gone through several color changes, from pale shock to a defensive red. "He was being disruptive," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I was trying to teach him that crying isn't appropriate at the dinner table. Sometimes children need clear boundaries." "He's 6 months old," David replied, still in that eerily calm tone. "He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him." He adjusted Lucas gently, checking his cheek where a faint red mark was still visible. "And you struck him hard enough to leave a mark." The room remained frozen in tableau. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a whisper. "Vanessa, honey, you shouldn't have—" "Don't," David interrupted, not raising his voice but somehow commanding immediate attention. "Don't minimize this. Don't excuse it. And don't you dare suggest that what just happened was acceptable in any way." He turned his attention back to Vanessa, who was now looking around the room as if searching for support that wasn't coming. "You are going to pack up your equipment and leave now. And you are not going to come near my family again until you can explain to me how you plan to ensure this never happens again." Vanessa's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "You can't just— this is my family too. You can't ban me from family gatherings." Her voice was gaining strength as she spoke, defensive anger replacing shock. "You're being completely unreasonable. It was barely a tap. You're acting like I committed some terrible crime." David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Anyone who had served under his command would have recognized the warning signs. Barely a tap that left a mark on my infant son's face," he said. "A tap administered because he was crying, which is literally the only way babies have to communicate distress." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member in turn. "And not one of you moved to stop her. Not one of you said a word. You all sat here and watched someone strike a baby, and you're now trying to minimize it because she's family?" The truth of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Patricia's face crumpled with something that might have been shame. Robert finally looked up from his plate, though he still couldn't quite meet David's gaze. Vanessa's defensive anger was wavering, being replaced by something that looked almost like recognition of what she'd done. But it was too late for recognition. David had made his decision. "Natalie," he said, turning to me with an expression that was gentle despite everything. "Pack Lucas's things. We're leaving." He paused, looking back at the family that had just revealed its true nature. "And we won't be coming back." I stood on shaking legs, my whole body still processing the shock of what had happened. Lucas was calm now in David's arms, but I could see the confusion in his wide eyes, the way he kept touching his cheek where Vanessa had hit him. The sight of it sent a wave of protective fury through me that I'd never experienced before. As I gathered our things from the guest room, I could hear voices from the dining room. Vanessa's, raised in what sounded like justification and deflection. Patricia's pleading and conciliatory. David's still calm but utterly immovable. By the time I returned with our overnight bag, the conversation had ended. David was standing by the front door with Lucas, our diaper bag already slung over his shoulder. His face was set, and that expression I'd learned meant the discussion was over and the decision was final. Vanessa stood near the dining room doorway, her face blotchy with tears and anger, while Patricia hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "This is insane," Vanessa called out as we headed toward the door. "You're destroying our family over nothing." "Over absolutely nothing! He's fine. Look at him. He's not even crying anymore." David stopped at the threshold and turned back one final time. "The fact that you think striking a baby is nothing tells me everything I need to know about your judgment," he said. "And the fact that the rest of this family is willing to excuse it tells me everything I need to know about their priorities." He opened the door and gestured for me to go ahead of him. As we walked toward our car, I could hear Patricia calling after us, begging us to come back, to talk this through, to not let one incident ruin the holiday. But David's stride never faltered, and neither did mine. We drove home in silence, Lucas sleeping peacefully in his car seat, his cheek now bearing only the faintest pink mark where Vanessa had struck him. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw still set in that grim line that meant he was working through something difficult. It wasn't until we were safely back in our own home, Lucas fed and settled in his crib, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sat on our couch, still wearing the dress I'd chosen so carefully for Christmas dinner, and began to cry. Not just for what had happened that evening, but for all the years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and overlooked by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. David sat beside me and pulled me close without saying anything. He understood that sometimes there were no words adequate for the situation, that sometimes comfort was just about being present and steady while someone processed their pain. "I'm proud of you," I finally whispered against his shoulder. "For what?" he asked, his voice soft. "For standing up. For protecting him. For not letting them minimize what happened." I pulled back to look at him. "I don't think anyone has ever defended me like that before." His expression softened in a way that was reserved just for quiet moments between us. "That's what real family does, Natalie. They protect each other. They don't excuse abuse, and they don't ask you to tolerate the intolerable for the sake of peace." Later that night, as I lay awake replaying the evening's events, I realized David was right about more than just that moment. This hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of a lifetime of experiences with people who demanded my silence, my accommodation, my willingness to accept less than I deserved. But this time had been different. This time, someone had stood up. Someone had said no. Someone had made it clear that the behavior was unacceptable and that there would be consequences. And as I drifted off to sleep next to my husband, with our baby safe in the next room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that comes from knowing your boundaries are respected and your worth is recognized. What I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The events of that Christmas dinner would set in motion a series of discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and my own strength. But for that night, it was enough to know that someone had finally stood up for what was right. The real war would begin 3 days later with a phone call. David was feeding Lucas his morning bottle, and I was staring numbly at the untouched Christmas present still wrapped under our tree. My mother, Patricia, sounded strained, almost breathless, as if she'd been rehearsing what to say. "Natalie, honey, I know you're upset, but we need to talk about what happened. Vanessa feels terrible about the whole thing. She didn't sleep at all last night. She wants to apologize properly, but she can't do that if you won't answer her calls." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, looking across the kitchen at David, who was watching me with concern. Lucas made happy gurgling sounds as he drank, completely unaware of the tension crackling through the house. The red mark on his cheek had faded to barely visible, but I could still see it if I looked closely enough. "Mom," I said finally, my voice carefully even, "she hit my baby. She struck a 6-month-old child because he was crying. I'm not sure what there is to discuss." "She barely touched him, Natalie. You're making this into something much bigger than it was. People make mistakes when they're stressed. You know how important her work is to her, and having the filming disrupted her work." I interrupted, feeling heat rise in my chest. "Mom." She slapped Lucas across the face because he was interfering with her social media content. "Do you hear how that sounds?" Patricia's sigh came through the phone like static. "You've always been dramatic about these things, sweetheart. Ever since you were little, you've blown situations out of proportion. Vanessa was just trying to teach him some boundaries. Sometimes children need firm guidance." The phrase hit me like cold water. "You've always been dramatic." How many times had I heard those exact words growing up? How many times had my legitimate concerns been dismissed with that precise explanation? I found myself gripping the phone tighter than necessary. He's 6 months old, Mom. He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him for expressing a basic need. Now you sound like David, Patricia said, and there was something in her tone that made me pause. He's always been very rigid about rules and procedures. Military men often are, but families work differently than the Army, Natalie. Families require flexibility and forgiveness. David looked up from Lucas's bottle, one eyebrow raised. He'd obviously heard enough of the conversation to catch his name being mentioned. I could see him making mental notes, the way he did when gathering intelligence about a situation that might require a strategic plan. What does David have to do with this? I asked. Well, he's the one who made the big scene. Vanessa said he was completely unreasonable, ordering people around like he was commanding troops. She said he threatened to ban her from the family. Patricia's voice trailed off, as if she couldn't find words for how inappropriate she found David's behavior. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Mom, David protected our son from someone who had just hit him. That's what fathers do. That's what anyone should do when they see a child being hurt. But Vanessa is family, honey. Family means giving people second chances. It means not letting one mistake destroy relationships that have been built over decades. David doesn't understand that because he didn't grow up with us. He doesn't know how we handle things. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, each exchange making me feel more disoriented. Patricia painted a picture of events that bore little resemblance to what I'd witnessed. In her version, Vanessa had barely made contact with Lucas. Everyone had overreacted, and David had turned a minor family disagreement into a major crisis through his inflexibility and outsider's perspective on family dynamics. When I finally hung up, David was watching me with the expression he wore when debriefing after a difficult mission. Let me guess, he said. It's our fault. According to my mother, yes. Vanessa feels terrible, but I'm being dramatic. And you're being controlling because you don't understand how families work. I slumped against the kitchen counter, feeling exhausted despite having been awake for less than 2 hours. She actually said that you don't understand family dynamics because you didn't grow up with them. She's right about that, David said quietly. I didn't grow up with them. I grew up in a family where adults protected children instead of making excuses for people who hurt them. The difference hit me with unexpected force. David's family had its own challenges, but I'd never heard his parents dismiss abuse or ask victims to be more understanding of their attacker. When his grandmother, Eleanor, had been alive, she'd been fiercely protective of all her grandchildren, never tolerating anyone who tried to harm them physically or emotionally. The phone rang again an hour later. This time, it was Robert, my father, speaking in the careful, measured tone he used when trying to mediate family conflicts. He'd clearly been coached on what to say, probably by Patricia because his words had a rehearsed quality that didn't match his usual scattered communication style. Natalie, I think we all need to take a step back and look at this situation more objectively. Your mother told me about her conversation with you this morning, and it sounds like there might be some miscommunication about what actually happened yesterday. Dad, there's no miscommunication. Vanessa hit Lucas. Multiple people saw it happen. There's nothing unclear about the situation. Well, that's just it. Vanessa said she was just trying to get his attention, maybe redirect his fussing. She said she might have been a little firmer than necessary, but she never intended to hurt him. And honestly, looking at him now, he seems fine. Children are resilient. I found myself staring at the ceiling, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of having my own father explain to me what had happened to my own child. Dad, intent doesn't matter when we're talking about hitting a baby. The impact matters. The fact that she thought striking him was an appropriate response to crying matters. But that's the thing, sweetheart. She's not experienced with babies. She was just trying to help in the moment. Sometimes people make poor choices when they're trying to handle unfamiliar situations. The conversation followed the same pattern as the one with Patricia. Every concern I raised was met with an explanation for why it wasn't really a problem. Every time I tried to center Lucas's well-being, the discussion was redirected to Vanessa's feelings, her inexperience, her stress levels, her good intentions. By the time Robert hung up, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I misunderstood what happened? Was I overreacting to something that was genuinely minor? The voices of my parents, people I'd trusted my entire life, were telling me that my perceptions were wrong, that my protective instincts were misguided, that my husband's response had been disproportionate. David found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my phone with an expression he later told me looked like shell shock. He'd finished settling Lucas for his morning nap and came to check on me, immediately recognizing that something had shifted during the second conversation. What did your dad say? He asked, sitting down across from me. He said that Vanessa didn't mean to hurt Lucas, that she was just trying to help, that maybe she was a little firmer than necessary, but children are resilient. I repeated the words in a flat tone, as if saying them might help me make sense of them. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then he asked, "What do you think happened yesterday?" The question surprised me, not because I didn't know the answer, but because no one else had asked me what I thought. Everyone had been telling me what to think, explaining what had really happened, correcting my understanding of events I'd witnessed with my own eyes. I think my sister hit my baby because he was crying and it was interfering with her filming. I think it was hard enough to leave a mark and shock him into silence. I think it was completely inappropriate and potentially harmful. I paused, feeling some clarity return as I spoke my own truth out loud. And I think my parents are more interested in protecting Vanessa from consequences than they are in protecting Lucas from being hurt again. That's what I think too, David said. So the question is, do you trust your own perceptions, or do you trust people who are telling you that what you saw didn't really happen? It was a fair question, but also a devastating one. The people asking me to doubt my own perceptions were my parents, people who had shaped my understanding of right and wrong for my entire life. The person supporting my perceptions was my husband, someone I'd known for 5 years, but who had consistently demonstrated better judgment and clearer moral boundaries than my family of origin. The third phone call came that afternoon, and this time it was Vanessa herself. Her voice was thick with tears, trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. This was the sister I remembered from childhood, vulnerable and seeking connection, rather than the polished influencer persona she'd developed over the years. "Nate, I feel so horrible about what happened. I haven't been able to eat or sleep since yesterday. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering how I could have handled things differently." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the conversation where she acknowledged what had happened and took responsibility for her actions. Maybe we could find a way forward that didn't require cutting her out of our lives entirely. "I'm glad you called, Vanessa. Lucas is okay, but I was really shocked by what happened. I need to understand why you thought hitting him was an appropriate response to his crying." "That's just it," she said, her voice gaining strength, the earlier vulnerability fading. "I don't think I really hit him. I think I just touched his cheek to get his attention. And maybe because everyone was so tense about the filming, it seemed like more than it was. You know how these things can get blown out of proportion when emotions are running high." The hope I'd felt moments earlier evaporated instantly. She wasn't calling to apologize or take responsibility. She was calling to continue the family narrative that what I'd witnessed hadn't really happened. "Vanessa, there was a sound when your hand made contact with his face. There was a mark on his cheek." He went from crying to completely silent in shock before he started wailing. "That's not a gentle touch to get someone's attention. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. I think everyone's perception was distorted by the stress of the situation, the cameras, the disrupted filming, David's reaction. It all created this atmosphere where a normal interaction got interpreted as something much more serious." I found myself gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Are you saying I imagined the mark on my baby's face?" "I'm saying that maybe what looked like a mark was just the natural redness that comes from crying. Maybe what sounded like a slap was just the sound of contact that seemed louder because the room was so quiet. Maybe what felt like a big deal in the moment isn't actually as serious as it seemed." The conversation continued in this vein for 20 more minutes. Vanessa had crafted an alternative narrative where her actions had been completely reasonable and everyone else's reactions had been excessive. She'd convinced herself that she was the victim of misunderstanding, possibly even a conspiracy to make her look bad. When I finally ended the call, I felt like I'd been wrestling with smoke. Every time I tried to pin down what had actually happened, she redirected the conversation to interpretations, perceptions, and alternative explanations that made my own memories feel unreliable. David found me in Lucas's nursery, standing over his crib and watching him sleep. He was lying on his back, one tiny fist curled near his face, completely peaceful and trusting. The sight of him, so small and defenseless, crystallized something inside me that had been building all day. "She's gaslighting me," I said without turning around. "All of them are. They're trying to make me believe that what I saw didn't really happen." "Yes," David said quietly. "They are. Why would they do that? Why would my own family try to make me doubt my own perceptions about something this serious?" David joined me at the crib, both of us watching our son sleep. Because acknowledging what really happened would require them to take action they're not willing to take. It would mean holding Vanessa accountable, which might disrupt their family dynamic. It would mean admitting they failed to protect Lucas, which would force them to examine their own behavior. So instead, they make you the problem. Instead, they make me the problem. The fourth call of the day came that evening, just as David and I were settling in to watch a movie after putting Lucas to bed. This time it was Patricia again, but her tone had shifted from pleading to frustrated. The careful diplomacy of the morning conversation had been replaced by something sharper. Natalie, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I'm concerned about how you're handling this situation. You're being very rigid and unforgiving, which isn't like you. I'm wondering if maybe the stress of new motherhood is affecting your judgment. I felt David tense beside me on the couch. The suggestion that my judgment was compromised by postpartum issues was a particularly low blow, and we both recognized it as such. Mom, my judgment is fine. My priorities are clear. Protecting my child from people who think it's acceptable to hit him isn't negotiable. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're characterizing this as hitting when it was clearly something much less serious. You're creating conflict where none needs to exist. You're making choices that are going to damage family relationships permanently over something that could be resolved with basic communication and forgiveness. What would resolution look like to you? I asked, genuinely curious about what she thought an acceptable outcome would be. Vanessa apologizes for the misunderstanding. You accept that she didn't mean any harm. David acknowledges that his reaction was excessive, and we all move forward with better communication and more patience for each other's differences. I let that sink in for a moment. In Patricia's vision of resolution, everyone bore equal responsibility for what had happened. Vanessa would offer a non-apology for a misunderstanding rather than accountability for her actions. I would accept blame for misinterpreting the situation. David would admit to overreacting to what he'd witnessed. And Lucas, the actual victim, would be completely absent from the conversation about making things right. What about Lucas? I asked. What does resolution look like for him? What do you mean? I mean, what protections would be put in place to ensure this doesn't happen again? What boundaries would be established to keep him safe at future family gatherings? What accountability measures would ensure that Vanessa has processed why hitting a baby is never acceptable? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then irritably, you're overthinking this. He's fine. He's not going to remember any of this. You're creating trauma where none exists. And there it was, the heart of our fundamental disagreement. In my family's worldview, trauma only existed if the victim remembered it clearly and could articulate its impact. A baby who couldn't form lasting memories of being struck couldn't be truly harmed by the experience. Adult comfort and family harmony took precedence over protecting children from experiences they might not remember. After I hung up, David and I sat in silence for several minutes. The movie we'd planned to watch remained paused on the opening screen while we both processed what was becoming clear. This wasn't going to blow over. My family wasn't going to come around to understanding why their response was inadequate, and we were going to have to make decisions about how to move forward with people who fundamentally disagreed with our basic values about protecting children. I feel like I'm going crazy, I admitted finally. 3 different people have told me that what I saw didn't really happen. People I've trusted my entire life are asking me to doubt my own perceptions about something this basic. That's the point, David said. They need you to doubt yourself because if you trust what you saw, you'll make choices they don't want you to make. If you believe Lucas was actually hurt, you'll protect him from people who might hurt him again. They can't have that. But why? Why is protecting Vanessa from consequences more important than protecting Lucas from being hurt? David was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through something complex. Finally, he said, I think your family has spent a long time organizing itself around managing Vanessa's needs and emotions. She's the center of attention, the source of drama, the person everyone has to accommodate. Protecting that system is more important than protecting individual members who threaten it. The observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. Growing up, family decisions had often been made based on how they would affect Vanessa's mood, her plans, her comfort level. Family gatherings were scheduled around her availability. Conversations were moderated to avoid topics that might upset her. Even my own achievements had been downplayed if they threatened to overshadow her latest project or accomplishment. I'd accepted this dynamic as normal, even healthy. Families supported their most sensitive members, made accommodations for people who needed extra attention, prioritized harmony over individual preference. It had never occurred to me that this support system could become so entrenched that it would prioritize Vanessa's comfort over a baby's safety. The final call of the day came close to midnight. I was already in bed but still awake, replaying the conversations and trying to make sense of the position my family was asking me to take. When I saw Vanessa's name on the caller ID, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity about whether her approach would be different in this late-night conversation. Natalie, I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about how to fix this mess. Her voice was softer than it had been earlier, less defensive and more sad. I miss you. I miss being close to you like we were when we were kids. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the relationship we'd had before life became complicated. There had been years when Vanessa and I were genuinely close, when her creativity and energy had felt inspiring rather than overwhelming, when her attention had felt like a gift rather than a performance. I miss that too, I said honestly. But I need you to understand why yesterday was so serious. Lucas is my baby, and seeing someone hurt him triggered every protective instinct I have. I get that. I really do. And I would never intentionally hurt him. You have to know that about me. Maybe I was too focused on the filming. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, but I would never deliberately harm a child. It felt like progress. This acknowledgement that her judgment had been compromised and that her actions had been inappropriate. For the first time all day, I felt like we might be able to find common ground. Thank you for saying that. I know you wouldn't hurt him on purpose, but impact matters as much as intent. And the impact was that he got hurt. What I need is some assurance that you understand why it happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Of course. I think what I need to do is be more mindful when I'm around children, especially when I'm stressed or working. Maybe I should ask for help instead of trying to handle situations on my own. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of what had happened, but it felt like movement in the right direction. We talked for another few minutes about boundaries and communication, about the challenges of balancing family time with work responsibilities, about the adjustments we'd all need to make as Lucas grew up. When we hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Christmas dinner. Maybe this could be worked out. Maybe we could establish clear boundaries and rebuild trust gradually. Maybe the relationships didn't have to be permanently damaged by one terrible moment. But the next morning brought a text message that shattered any hope I'd had for reconciliation. It was from Chloe Martinez, our neighbor at Fort Henderson, who had become a close friend over the past year. The message was brief but devastating. Saw Vanessa's Instagram story. Are you okay? I opened Instagram with shaking hands, navigating to Vanessa's account. The story was titled Family Drama and Moving Forward, and it was a carefully crafted narrative about the challenges of blending families with different parenting styles. She talked about the difficulties of holiday gatherings, the stress of documenting family moments, and the importance of forgiveness and grace when misunderstandings occur. According to her version of events, there had been a minor disagreement about appropriate behavior at dinner, escalated by miscommunication and different expectations. She painted herself as someone trying to help, with a fussy baby who had been misunderstood by overprotective parents unfamiliar with extended family dynamics. She never mentioned hitting Lucas, never acknowledged that any harm had been done, and characterized the entire conflict as a learning experience about family communication. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Her followers praised her maturity, her grace under pressure, her commitment to family relationships despite difficult circumstances. Several people shared their own stories about in-law conflicts and parenting disagreements, offering advice about setting boundaries and managing different parenting philosophies. I screenshot the entire story before it could disappear, then sat staring at my phone in disbelief. Less than 12 hours after what had felt like a breakthrough conversation about accountability and prevention, Vanessa had publicly reframed the entire incident as a misunderstanding caused by my overreaction and David's inflexibility. She had taken the private conversation we'd had about her poor judgment and stress levels and transformed it into a public narrative about other people's unreasonable expectations. She had positioned herself as the victim of family drama rather than the adult who had struck a baby. And she had done it all while maintaining plausible deniability, never technically lying while also never telling the truth. When David came home from his morning run and found me crying at the kitchen table, I showed him the phone without saying anything. He read through the Instagram story twice, his expression growing grim with each sentence. "She played you," he said finally. The late-night call, the apparent acknowledgement of responsibility, the promise to be more mindful, all of it was designed to get information she could use to craft this narrative. I felt foolish for having believed that the conversation represented genuine remorse or growth. But more than that, I felt betrayed by someone I'd loved and trusted since childhood, someone who had used my willingness to give her another chance as an opportunity to further manipulate the situation. The phone started ringing again, but this time I didn't answer. I could see it was Patricia, probably calling to discuss Vanessa's Instagram story and encourage me to see it as a positive step toward resolution. But I was done listening to explanations about why my perceptions were wrong and my boundaries were unreasonable. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in a family conflict. I started documenting everything. I wrote down exactly what had happened at Christmas dinner, including direct quotes from everyone involved. I saved screenshots of Vanessa's Instagram story and the supportive comments from her followers. I made notes about each phone conversation, including the specific language my family members had used to minimize the incident and question my judgment. For the first time in my life, I was treating my family like potential adversaries rather than trusted allies. And as I organized the evidence of their gaslighting and manipulation, I began to understand that this pattern had been happening for much longer than just the past few days. This was how they had always handled conflicts that threatened their preferred narrative. This was how they had always managed situations where Vanessa's behavior created problems for other people. This was how they had trained me over decades to doubt my own perceptions and prioritize family harmony over my own well-being. But this time was different. This time the victim wasn't just me, it was my infant son, someone who couldn't advocate for himself or choose to walk away from a harmful situation. This time I had a partner who supported my perceptions and validated my concerns rather than asking me to be more understanding of people who had hurt us. And this time I was going to fight back. The documentation process revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized before. As I scrolled through old text messages and social media posts, a clear picture emerged of how my family had been managing conflicts for years. Every time Vanessa created a problem, the same cycle played out. Initial shock, followed by explanations and excuses, then pressure on everyone else to accommodate her version of events. I found a text thread from 2 years earlier when Vanessa had shown up 4 hours late to our grandmother Eleanor's memorial service, because she'd been filming a collaboration with a makeup brand. Instead of addressing her disrespect, the family had spent the entire reception discussing how grief affects people differently and how we all cope with loss in our own way. My hurt feelings about her absence during the most important parts of the service had been reframed as selfishness during a difficult time. Another thread from last spring revealed a similar pattern when Vanessa had borrowed Patricia's car and returned it with significant damage from what she called a minor parking lot incident. The insurance claim showed thousands of dollars in repairs. But the family conversation focused on how accidents happen and how material possessions weren't worth damaging. Relationships. Patricia had ended up paying the deductible herself rather than asking Vanessa to take responsibility. The more I looked, the clearer it became that I had been trained to accept this dynamic as normal family behavior. I'd learned to minimize my own needs, question my own perceptions, and prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. The Christmas dinner incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the most extreme example of a pattern that had been shaping my life for decades. David found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed screenshots and handwritten notes, creating what looked like a case file for a criminal investigation. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from me, studying the organized evidence I'd spread across the surface. "This looks like intelligence gathering," he observed. "That's exactly what it is. I'm trying to understand how they do this, how they consistently manage to make me feel like I'm the problem when they're the ones causing harm." I gestured to a timeline I'd created of family conflicts over the past 5 years. "Look at this pattern. Every single time, the same thing happened." David examined the timeline, noting the recurring elements: incident, denial, reframing, pressure to forgive, eventual acceptance of the family narrative. It's sophisticated. They've created a system that protects Vanessa from consequences, while training everyone else to doubt their own judgment. But why me specifically? Why am I always the one being asked to be more understanding, more forgiving, more flexible? Because you're the one who challenges. You're the one who notices when things don't add up. You're the one who asks uncomfortable questions. He pointed to several incidents on my timeline. "Look at these. In every case, you were the person who initially called out the problematic behavior. They need to neutralize you because you're the threat to their system." The observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. I had always been the family member who pointed out inconsistencies, who asked why certain behaviors were acceptable, who pushed for accountability when things went wrong. I thought of myself as helpful, as someone who wanted to improve family dynamics by addressing problems directly. But from the family's perspective, I was a disruptor who threatened their carefully maintained equilibrium. My phone buzzed with another text from Patricia. "Honey, I saw that you read Vanessa's Instagram story. I hope you can see that she's really trying to move forward in a positive way. Maybe we could all get together this weekend to talk through everything calmly." I showed the message to David, who shook his head. "They're trying to reset the narrative again. Get everyone in the same room, apply social pressure, and convince you to accept their version of events for the sake of family peace. But what if I'm wrong? What if I am being too rigid, too unforgiving? What if there really is a way to work through this that doesn't require cutting people out of our lives?" David set down his coffee cup and looked at me seriously. "Let me ask you something. If one of my soldiers struck a baby during a family gathering and then spent the next week convincing everyone that it hadn't really happened, while publicly reframing themselves as the victim, what would you think I should do?" The question clarified everything instantly. If this were happening to anyone else's family, if I were watching from the outside, I would be horrified by the gaslighting and manipulation. I would advise them to protect their child and maintain clear boundaries with people who refuse to acknowledge harmful behavior. I would tell them to document everything and stay away from people who think hitting babies is negotiable. "Right, so why is your family different?" I didn't have a good answer for that question. The only reason I was considering compromise was because these were people I'd loved my entire life. People whose approval I'd sought since childhood. People whose rejection felt like losing a fundamental part of my identity. But none of those reasons justified exposing Lucas to people who might hurt him again. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Chloe Martinez. She'd been following the situation since sending me the text about Vanessa's Instagram story, and she had information that changed everything. Natalie, I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure how you're going to take it. I've been going through Vanessa's social media more carefully, and I found some posts from earlier this year that I think you need to see. She sent me screenshots of several posts from Vanessa's account dating back to when Lucas was first born. One showed a professional photo shoot she'd done using baby props and accessories, captioned with something about the beauty of new beginnings and the joy of expanding family. Another featured her holding what appeared to be a newborn with text about the blessings of being an aunt and the special bond between sisters. The problem was the timing. Both posts had been published weeks before Lucas was actually born, using stock photos and borrowed babies to create content about an experience she hadn't had yet. She'd been monetizing her relationship with my unborn child, creating sponsored content about our family moments before they'd even happened. There's more, Chloe said when I called her back after reviewing the screenshots. I found a whole series of posts about family traditions, holiday celebrations, and multi-generational gatherings that all feature photos from Christmas dinner last year. The one you and David missed because of his deployment? She's been creating this narrative about close family relationships that doesn't actually exist. I felt sick looking at the evidence. Vanessa had built a brand around family content that portrayed relationships and experiences that were largely fiction. Her followers believed she was documenting authentic family moments, but she was actually crafting carefully staged content designed to generate engagement and sponsorship opportunities. The Christmas dinner incident started making more sense in this context. Vanessa hadn't just been filming for personal documentation. She'd been creating content for a business that depended on maintaining a specific image of family harmony and celebration. Lucas's crying had threatened not just her filming schedule, but her entire brand identity as someone who effortlessly managed beautiful family moments. When David came home that evening, I showed him everything Chloe had discovered. He studied the evidence with the methodical attention he gave to intelligence briefings, noting dates, inconsistencies, and patterns that revealed the scope of Vanessa's deception. She's been using your family as content for months, he said, and not just documenting real experiences. She's been creating fictional narratives about relationships that exist primarily for her audience, which means the Christmas dinner wasn't about family time at all. It was about creating content that would support her brand. Lucas and I were just props in her production. And when Lucas interfered with the production by acting like a normal baby, she prioritized her content over his well-being. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment by someone who cared about us, but was overwhelmed by stress. This had been a calculated decision by someone who viewed our family as raw material for her business, and who was willing to harm a child to protect her commercial interests. I spent the evening going through more of Vanessa's content, documenting the extent to which she'd been monetizing our family relationships without our knowledge or consent. She'd used photos of our wedding, stories about David's deployment, and speculation about our future children to create sponsored posts about military families, long distance,